Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing another new fantasy releases wrap up specifically for the Northwind, Foul Days, and How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying. I did do a non-spoiler review for Foul Days, so if you've already heard about that one, of course feel free to skip ahead when I do talk about it, but just in general, as always, I'll have timestamps in the description bar down below in case there is only one specific book you're interested in or if you'd like to reference back to these at a future time. And then just for your convenience, if you are interested in any of these, I'll have links in the description bar so you can check them out. But anyway, jumping into it, I'm going to start with How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying. This book was, I think, my least favorite thing I have ever completed. Of course, there are books I have picked up, immediately recognized, oh, this isn't for me, and then just DNF'd them. There are books that I didn't like, but I kept thinking, well, maybe, surely, things will turn around. And then I found that was not the situation. With this book, it was an interesting combination of both of those things pretty much by page 2. And that's not an exaggeration. I can tell you the exact footnote that I was like, uh-oh. So pretty much from page 2, I was thinking, I don't think this is gonna be for me. And yeah, I kept going because I was hopeful that a lot of what I was getting at the very beginning of the book would transform into something, or that the themes that I was pulling from the book, even that I use that phrase lightly because part of me is like, am I just trying to make this deeper than it was? But anyway, the themes, I was actually enjoying what I was getting from what I thought was being put into the story. So I kept thinking, okay, maybe there will be a point that it turns around. And then I just never found that that was the case. So I do want to make very clear from the start that a big thing that I think is going to be relatively divisive for readers is the humor. And I want to be very clear, as humor is something that's very difficult to gauge just from a YouTube video. Obviously, all of you don't, well, most of you anyway, don't know me personally unless one of my friends is watching, which they would know me. But most of you don't know me personally, so you don't know what kinds of things I find funny, what kinds of things that I chuckle at or that I get a hearty laugh from. And I want to kind of let you know a little bit about that, as I do think it is helpful for you to know. That way, if the premise sounds good and you think, oh, okay, well, my humor might be a little different from hers, then you'll know to just disregard the things that didn't work for me. But I find a lot of different kinds of humor funny. I do find the kind of humor where, you know, you're leading the person to think you're about to say one thing and then you say something else, that can be funny. And when people are constantly sort of self-deprecating humor, that can be funny. A recurring joke can be funny. Even ridiculously juvenile jokes, and especially oftentimes the thing that goes hand in hand with that is really over-the-top sexual jokes, I can find those funny too. So some examples of things that are different kinds of humor from shows that you maybe have seen is I do find the show Parks and Rec to be, obviously it's somewhat satirical, but it's also very silly. I find Parks and Rec to be funny. I also find the show What We Do in the Shadows to be funny, which is a mockumentary about vampires trying to live their lives among humans, and these vampires are both incredibly stupid and extremely ready to go, I'll say, all the time. So there's a lot of dumb sex humor in that, but also there's a lot of relatively clever ways in which they clash with the regular human existence. And then shows like Veep, which is like, what if Parks and Rec had despicable people and maybe felt a little bit more realistic to what it feels like maybe we assume a lot of politics is like. I also find that funny. So I do feel that there's a lot of different areas that I find funny. I'm a big fan of stand-up comedy. I have watched, if you even have some name recognition, I have probably watched you. And when I say you, I don't mean literally any of you, unless some of you are comedians, I don't know. The idea, though, that I'm trying to get across is that I do find so many different kinds of things funny. I think what doesn't work for me is when the humor is one note over and over and over again for the entirety of a story, which is what I think this book did. For some people, if that one note is a pleasant note, you like that note, then the consistency of the bit, you could say, is probably going to really work for you. The humor in this is incredibly immature. I'll give some setup as to what the premise is if you don't know, and then I'll dive into how the humor fits in. So the setup for the story and the tone, I think, are both relatively clear based off the title, How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying. The idea is that our main character is somebody who is basically destined to become the hero of the tale, and that they are destined to defeat the Dark Lord. However, they have not only not accomplished that, they have not accomplished that over and over and over and over again. They have died so many times that it's to a point where they decide, I'm done trying to defeat the Dark Lord. I do not want to spend years of my life starting over, because that's literally what happens when they die. They start right back from where they started before, and it's essentially resetting. All of existence resets to the beginning of this tale, and then they have to try again. And because they're so tired of it, they've decided, I'm going to try to just be the Dark Lord this time. Why not? It's never worked trying to be the hero. I might as well give being evil a try. And I liked the idea of that. I appreciated that. I felt that the marketing was very upfront, and the synopsis itself and the title. They were all upfront that this was going to not take itself too seriously, so I anticipated that it was going to be probably pretty ridiculous. But I also felt that one of the themes that I do feel the book was going for, and that I was looking forward to, is the idea of this sort of, in a way, being a subtle representation of the way in which so many of us are reaching for some impossible ideal, and life, whether it be through familial expectations or societal expectations, or just the way in which our institutions push back on us, the way there's injustices, even as simple as your boss sucks and there's nothing you can do about it. Whatever the situation is, it just feels like no matter how hard you try, life is constantly beating you down, and you just have to get up every single day and go at it again. You just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Someday, you too can be uber rich and successful, and then you can finally relax because you've done it. You've reached the ideal. And for the majority of people, that's not their reality. They try really hard only to just constantly have things set them back or push back against them until you eventually grow old and die, if you're lucky enough to live that long, which I feel like that was what we were going for, and what was, as I said, I think somewhat being represented through this character who's just sick of it all. They're sick of going over and over and over again and being told that they will succeed. They just gotta go for it. And it's also taking that concept and tying it to the familiar trope of the hero's journey, but then doing a subversion of that trope. And I liked all of these concepts. I liked all of the ingredients, but the way it all came together did not work. And the humor was a big part of it. So I mentioned that I felt the humor was very one note. I do feel that the character, they are obviously so done with everything, and that's very clear in how they approach. Everything's a big joke to them. Like, yep, whatever. Oh, by the way, I'm the Dark Lord. And they go around and they announce it to people. And the way they've, at the beginning of their quest to, at this point, become the Dark Lord, they let themselves die over and over again so they can figure out just exactly the right way to talk to somebody, to learn their moves, to figure out, okay, they're going to hit me at this point, so I got to dodge here. And they're clever and sneaky about how they're going about it at the beginning, but it does mean that they have to consistently die over and over and over again. So it's also extremely violent and quite grotesque, which, hey, that's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, and I'm not even complaining about that in the story. But they do that a number of times until they finally get far enough along. They're like, okay, now I'm at it for real. But even then, they're not really taking anything too seriously. They're happy to just give commands, to hook up with whoever they want, to speak however they want, to give themselves ridiculous titles whenever. And this main character, the reason that I just, very early, immediately basically was like, I don't know if this is for me, is that the main character consistently has one of two thoughts for basically any person they interact with, or any creature they interact with, because it is a fantasy world, and sometimes they interact with things that are not quite people. So they'll go to interact with some humanoid-like being, and if it's even somewhat human-shaped, our main character will be like, I wonder how they have sex. And then she'll have thoughts about how they have sex and think about either them having sex with other humanoid-like beings that are within their species, or she wonders about having sex with them. And then if it's some kind of cute little creature, then she's like, oh my gosh, they're so cute, OMG. And I wish I was kidding about that being what the main character sounds like, but that is what the main character sounds like. And I'm not a fan also. I don't mind the occasional snarky character, or character that talks like us, or character who breaks the fourth wall. Aren't I edgy? Yeah. I don't mind small doses of that. But when you crank it up to level 1000, I'm like, I can't do it. I can't do it. And I did do it. I did complete the book, but I probably should have DNF'd on page 2. Page 2. Because there's a footnote. Just to give you an idea, the book opens with the scene of the character being tortured. This is the last time that she has tried becoming the hero of the tale, and she's been captured. This is how a lot of the times end, is with her captured and tortured. And then once she dies, then she's got to start over again. So we're seeing one of those instances occur. And one of the torturers is like this snake lady. And as a result of being kind of a snake lady, she has an interesting snake-like tongue. And our character, there's footnotes throughout the story. They're almost always just like, what if this person's body part is what they use when they're having sex? I wish I was being sarcastic. I wish I was exaggerating. I'm not. Anyway, so on page 2, there's a footnote, and it's basically like, I wonder what it feels like to have their tongue down there. But way later in the story, the character also mentions that they've been so sexually frustrated that they've been dealing with things themselves. I probably should have let some of you know. If you have, some of you I know watch with your kids around, I probably should have let you know you might want to put headphones in. But okay, I'm going to continue on. But there's a part way later in the book where the character is sexually frustrated, and they're talking to somebody that they've had their eye on, and they're talking about their feelings, and then they both realize they're into each other, and the character's like, you're telling me I've had feelings for you. Wait, you've had feelings for me this whole time too? Are you serious? That's sort of the situation. They're expressing their feelings for someone, discovering this person has feelings for them too, and they basically have to like, dude, are you serious this whole time? We could have been together. But instead of saying that, they're like, I've been giving myself tennis arm going at myself so aggressively. Anyway, I think it just got like ickier, because there's also a part where I was like, can we not bring animals or any like relation to animals into the equation? And I'll explain before your mind goes somewhere that's worse than this. But there's a character at one point that our main character hooks up with, and they have a tail. When they finish, their tail wags a lot, kind of like a dog when they get peanut butter or something like that. And I have screenshots for all of these things because it's a library book. So actually it's a lie. I have pictures because it was a library physical book, so I had to take pictures of these passages. But they're pretty much burned into my brain at this point. And I mean, it's one of those situations where I do kind of feel like if this was a romance novel and the romantic encounters were described in a way that I found funny, I feel I don't know, maybe this isn't true, but I almost feel like there's a hesitation to look at a fantasy novel that is marketed as fantasy and obviously is marketed as being campy and ridiculous and edgy and over the top. So it's marketed accurately, I think. But I do think for some reason that there's less of I guess, level of criticism versus if this were a romance novel and it was some kind of, because there are some interesting smut stories out there. Like, what's the one about balloon animals, the squeakers, or something like that? I haven't read it, but there are the ones that also are very upfront and over the top, and they make that very clear, but there is a level of, I think, almost snark that, or just immediate dismissal of those things, even if their intention is to be satirical or they're using something absolutely ridiculous to actually try to make some kind of point. But if it's marketed as some kind of smut, then maybe this is just all, maybe I'm projecting onto all of you in advance, and I don't mean to do that. So maybe none of you are feeling this way, but I don't know. The kinds of conversations I hear and the sort of language I hear about romance or smut stories that are really over the top, I do feel it can be quite critical, whereas I just feel as if for some reason this is immediately going to be like, oh, that sounds funny, because it's categorized as fantasy and not something else. I almost think that the unusual sexual encounters and urges and constant talking about sexual things might have irritated me less if the story felt like it did also something different, or that it was more than just a subversion of a trope. I almost feel like the subversion of a trope as the foundation from which we are building a story has in and of itself become a trope at this point. So if you're gonna start marketing yourself as, I am this trope but a little different or totally flipped upside down, then I still want there to be something unique as the story progresses, and it just felt like it was the same thing over and over again, which, tying this all back to what I was saying, is potentially a theme of this story, of the repetition of day-to-day life and just growing sick of everything. Maybe in a sense it was meant to capture that, but I also kind of am like, or am I just putting onto it something deeper than it is, and maybe it is just supposed to be basically pure nonsense? There's one element to the book that I kind of liked, which is the character. They had this realization at one point of, wait a second, what if I am successful this time? Because they get pretty far along. That's the whole idea, is that they're trying to get really far along in this quest to become the Dark Lord. So they have this realization of, oh my gosh, what if this is the time that actually everything works? And I've gone down this basically path of no return. If this is the time that works, that means everybody who's died up until this point, it's not just a game, it's for real. Those people are dead, and they have this sort of existential crisis, which I enjoyed that. I don't know, am I conveying how much I disliked this, or are you like, no, I kind of want to read it? Which, if you do want to read it because it sounds good, that's great, but does it come across like I liked it? I don't know. I didn't like it. I didn't think it was, I really was hoping that it would be different than it was, and what I got was not something I enjoyed. But if you do check this book out, then I hope you greatly enjoy it, or at the very least somewhat enjoy it. I hope that you like the humor, and I hope that you just have fun with it all. But alas, I did not. Best of luck to you if you pick it up. I hope you really like it. Moving on, though, to The North Wind. So this particular book is a fantasy romance story, and I actually felt, interestingly, like this is the closest in its setup and the pacing of its plot to A Court of Thorns and Roses. The main character is somebody who is looking after their sister. They definitely have to take on the role of protector, hunter, provider. They have to do all these things just so that their sister can relax and enjoy life at least a little bit. Our main character has done a lot of things for her sister, some of which her sister is aware of, and some that our character keeps from her. And it really does, I think, right from the start, showcase what our character is willing to do for those she loves. And this extends into a tradition within where they live, which is that at some point this being, who they have as the North Wind, is sort of the idea. It's a Beauty and the Beast retelling, so it's this person who's sort of off in the distance, there's lore around them, but it's all primarily negative, and this person comes into their village and at some point demands a bride, and the character is distraught when they realize that the North Wind is going to pick her sister. So because of some of the ways in which they look alike, she goes in her sister's place, and it's not until she's taken back across this wall, essentially, that the North Wind realizes that he has been deceived. And at this point, it is too late. Our main character's already here. And then throughout the story, as you can guess, because it is a fantasy romance, you're seeing the way in which these two characters sort of break down the barriers between them. They get to know each other. They get to understand each other's trauma. And then they slowly build at least somewhat of a little bit of respect, and then a tiny bit of a friendship, and then eventually we segue into it becoming something romantic. I do enjoy a good love story. I do really enjoy the development of relationships between characters of all kinds, whether it be friendships, familial, or romantic. And in this instance, I was, for a little while, actually enjoying that we were taking our time, because something that I don't appreciate is when you just see the characters immediately being head over heels for each other and immediately the insta-love. I know that that can be somewhat realistic if characters are extremely young, or sometimes they just have instant attraction for each other, and then that can lead to something else. But the immediate, like, I will die for you, let the world burn, even though I've only known you for a couple of days, I never liked that, and I don't feel that the story was doing it. I do think our main character was understandably resistant and pushed back against the character who took them and whisked them away from everything they've ever known. I also felt that the story did a pretty good job of dissecting the main character's addiction, as she has oftentimes used alcohol to cope with a lot of what she has gone through, as she didn't want to burden her sister with so many of the things that she has put herself through on her behalf, and she's turned to alcohol as a result. But that does mean that anytime any situation somewhat starts to get out of her control, that is what she turns to, and I do feel that the author was exploring that quite well. But all that to say, and the reason I was starting to get to the point of I do enjoy a good love story from time to time, is I don't want it to come across like once this formally became a romance that suddenly I didn't like it because I don't like romance. That's not the situation. But there's something about when the relationship did get into more romantic territory and was really settled into like, okay, they're having a romantic relationship now, that I do feel we kind of set aside a lot of the development of the character and the exploration of the trauma that both her and the love interest have experienced. I kind of feel like we set that aside to sort of just be like, now we are angsty. And I felt there was a little bit of a switch. So I enjoyed a part of this story, and then I don't know if it was exactly necessarily like the second half versus the first half, but I'm just, for the convenience of it, say that the latter half wasn't necessarily as much my taste. I do think that I would be curious to read something else by this author. It could just be that it was this particular couple. It could just be that it was treading on very familiar ground. I'm sure just in hearing about this main character and her background, I'm sure a lot of you can see why I was mentioning that there's a lot of parallels between it and A Court of Thorns and Roses. If you don't know, I don't hate ACOTAR and I don't love ACOTAR. I think it's fine, and I certainly can see that it has had a huge impact on fantasy and fantasy romance as a whole, but I'm not like a ride or die or anything like that. And so if it comes across in any way like the only reason that the parallels are negative is because I'm somehow protective of ACOTAR or something, that's not the case. I just think there are some very obvious similarities between the two. And at some point, I did a video kind of breaking down why it feels like so many of the popular fantasy romance in particular don't end up working for me. And I was hitting a lot of the points of things that you see in a lot of them that are popular. And we're kind of riding on certain tropes or riding on certain trends. And I tend to prefer when it feels like we're doing something a little bit different, something a little more unique. So I do think a tiny bit that the similarities between this and some of the other fantasy romances out there, it did kind of take it down a bit for me. But for some people, they are wanting more of something that they already enjoy. And if that's the case for you, then I could see this being different enough that it could really be something that you quite enjoy. I think that the main characters are somewhat unlikable initially, and then you're seeing as they not only grow individually but grow together. And I think that that is potentially really appealing to a lot of readers. So this is a story that by the end of it, it didn't quite work out for me, but I do feel that the pacing of the development of a lot of what was transpiring could really work for a lot of other people. One last thing I'll say about this is that as a result, I think of it being something building off of the Beauty and the Beast story, is that the settings, while I thought the descriptions were well written, I wouldn't say that the setting felt like anything all that interesting or new or dynamic. And I think that if you're somebody who is looking for a setting you can get lost in, or a world that feels so entirely different, or at least even somewhat different than what you're accustomed to, I don't really feel that this one is going to probably hit that for you. Last for today, we have Foul Days. As I said before, this is one that I did a non-spoiler review for, so if you'd like to hear more in-depth non-spoiler thoughts, or if you've already heard about this, then you can either check out that video, or you can just click off if you've already heard about it. But this was not only my favorite of the three that we're talking about today, but it's one of my favorite books of the year, one of my favorite new fantasy releases. I thought it was so much fun. I loved the world. I thought it was a good blend of familiar and unique. I really enjoyed the way in which the story progressed. I liked the setup. So the idea is that you're following this young woman named Kusara, and she lives within this city that is plagued by monsters. She, however, is relatively equipped to handle monsters as she is a witch, and she has done a lot to study how to go against certain kinds of monsters, what sorts of things will work against them. And she also is somebody who she did study from someone who is very skilled. She had a great mentor, so she's relatively capable. But there is a certain time of year where the monsters, even if you're a witch, you want to avoid being out on the streets. And that would be the first 12 days of the year, as the veil between their world and the world of monsters is lighter and the monsters can cross through much easier. And so for 12 days, pretty much everybody in this city holes up in some kind of building, they stick together and they wait it out. And our main character, even though she is equipped to handle monsters, one, the influx of them, as I mentioned, is already dangerous, but two, she has something in her past that has to do with what is the Tsar of monsters. And she is very afraid of this particular being. You don't know the history of her relationship with this being. You don't know what has happened in the past, but it's clear that she has been harmed by this monster before. So she's doing everything she can to avoid him, but he finds her at the very beginning of the story. And in order to escape him, she makes a deal with someone who has the ability to get her across the wall of their city into a neighboring city that does not have monsters, as the wall keeps the monsters out. So Kusara bargains away her shadow, which is what witches derive their magic from. She bargains her shadow away so that she can escape. And once this happens, she very quickly realizes, I need to get my shadow back if one, I want my magic back, and two, if I want to survive, as there is this shadow sickness that starts to happen once witches don't have their shadows, and if they don't get their own shadows back fast enough, then they will end up becoming a shadow themselves. So it's kind of like, we gotta hustle here, we gotta hurry, or she is going to die, basically. She's also on the run from this monster, and on top of all of that, she's in new terrain. She's never been outside of her city. She's never been on the other side of the wall. And because of how quickly the monster was able to find her, she surmises that she might have been betrayed by someone she knows. And there is, as a result, somewhat of a mystery as well within the story. And so her and an unlikely ally come together to basically solve this mystery, for her to try to get her shadow back, and for her to either finally face the monster or to escape him. I thought that this was so much fun. I loved the setting. I thought that the charisma of the story was also a blast. It was, for me, a really fantastic blend of kind of creepy adventurous and then also ridiculous at the same time. So this is an example of something where the humor, I think, really balanced well with a lot of the rest of the story. It had ingredients that are somewhat familiar. So as an example, one of the comm titles for this is Witcher, and I absolutely can see some of the similarities. There's definitely a lot of Eastern European folklore inspirations, and there's a lot of nods to a lot of folklore within this, which I liked. But the story absolutely stands on its own, and I don't think that its tone or its plot is quite like anything I've encountered. So I just thought that this was so much fun, and I really, right from the start, I was already really invested in the setting and the way that the magic worked, and I felt very quickly that the stakes were quite high and well established. And I do feel like there's an additional level of depth once you start to dissect our main character and you learn more about her trauma. I think the way that that's handled is something a lot of people are going to really, really connect with. So I highly recommend Foul Days, especially if you happen to watch this around the fall season in October, then this is the perfect time to pick it up. I also know that its sequel is coming out in 2024, which is the year the first one came out as well. And so if you're somebody who prefers to not start things unless you know the end of the series is in sight, then you're in luck, as the sequel is going to be the end of this duology, and it will be coming out very soon. So I not only enjoyed this, but I am now highly anticipating the second book. I hope if you pick it up that you enjoy it, and I hope if you pick up any of these that you like them. Obviously, it was kind of a 1 out of 3 for me, I would say, but your mileage may vary on all of these books. They're quite different from each other, so hopefully there's something here that sounds good to you. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.